Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, May the 27th, 2025. Time is a funny thing, though. Some periods in history never seem to die. A few days ago, Salman Rushdie's attacker, uh, his most recent attacker anyway, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Salman Rushdie said a couple of days ago that he was pleased with the attacker's maximum sentence. Of course, the Rushdie affair, as it was known and continues to be known, blew up over his 1988 book, The Satanic Verses, which reflected perhaps the religious quality of the 80s. That's certainly the view of our guest today, who perhaps believes that the 80s still isn't dead. The book is called The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s by a very distinguished writer and scholar, Paul Elie, and he's joining us from Brooklyn, New York, where he lives. Paul, is it true that some decades simply don't go away? And is that the truth about the 80s, why you've written The Last Supper?
Well, I wrote the book in part to frame a period in time to try to complicate our simple way of registering time in terms of decades. The book begins in October 79, when shortly after the hostages were taken in Tehran, Bob Dylan went on Saturday Night Live and played music from his new record, Slow Train Coming, a gospel record. And it goes through to 92, when Sinead O'Connor, also on Saturday Night Live, tore up a photograph of the Pope. So that's really a 13-year span that was characterized by what I call crypto-religious music and art and literature and film. And so, of course, the 80s is in the subtitle, but the whole effort of the book is to complicate what's called periodicization and the way we think about history.
So my introduction falls into the very trap you're warning about. We shouldn't be talking about what you call periodization. The 80s are as perhaps meaningless as the 60s, 70s, or 90s.
Well, no. First of all, it's not a trap. We have to do it.
We don't have to do it, Paul, do we? I mean, we could just avoid talking about periods, as you say.
In theory, we could, and it could be, as some famous philosopher put it, history is just one damn thing after another. But it's a natural and legitimate impulse to want to understand the succession of eras in history, and just a lot of what someone doing the kind of thing that I do does is try to find starting points that actually exist in events rather than just on the calendar. So this period that I'm writing about, 79 to 92, hostages being taken, famous Jewish rebellious American artist embracing an evangelical Christianity, other things happening in that period, the United States becoming religiously more diverse. That was both an ending to what I would call the long 60s that preceded that period, and the beginning of a time that we're still in, a 45-year time with 9/11 more or less in the middle of it. And so just trying to see the recent past in terms of significant events and developments, and not just to assume that because the calendar changed from 1989 to 1990 that we're in a different experience.
Yeah, I was very intrigued in the book that you begin this bookend between Dylan's Slow Train Coming and then the Sinead O'Connor stuff that we'll come to later. Slow Train Coming is 1979, was the first of a trilogy of, I guess, Christian albums that Dylan put out. But those were followed, and you see this in the wonderful bootleg series he came out with a few years ago, Springtime in New York, 1980 to 1985. Those were followed by Infidels, which is, in many critics' view, Dylan's return to form. I don't want to turn this into a conversation about Bob Dylan, but in terms of your narrative, some people might say, well, why would he focus on Dylan, who had a 3-album flirtation with Christianity, then lost interest, got bored, or changed his view of things and went back to the old ways. What's the significance then of Slow Train coming? If Dylan really didn't maintain a great deal of interest in religion for most of the 80s?
It's a really good question, and one that has a really robust and complicated answer as I see it. So Dylan's embrace of Christianity, nobody really understands it. But from my point of view, he saw a slow train coming around the bend. That's his own lyrics. And what he envisioned and grasped before other artists was that a lot of the heat and light in the coming years was going to involve the interpenetration of the arts and religion. So he anticipated much of the work of later in the decade. Then he influenced a lot of the people whose stories figure into the narrative. He was a huge influence on U2, both in that period, and then when the Biograph box set came out with him pictured as a stained glass saint on the sleeve. His lyrics, even after he stopped putting out the explicitly Christian records, had pronounced religious overtones in a whole bunch of songs. Ring Them Bells, Wine Willie McTell. Sinead O'Connor, the first album she had really as a teenager was Slow Train Coming. So her career, she was a generation and a half younger than Dylan, but was shaped by that record. And so even when he moved on, the tributaries that flowed away from his work were going into other people's work. Leonard Cohen too. They were both singers on Columbia Records, and they compared notes about their what I call crypto-religious songs of that period at a cafe in Paris in 1986.
Yeah, we've done shows on Cohen and his own religious awakening or reawakening. Of course, he was from a much more religious family, much more grounded in Talmudic scholarship, certainly than Dylan. We did a show about Cohen's experience in Israel. You use this phrase, Paul, crypto-religion or crypto-religious. It seems to be the core theme in The Last Supper. What does it mean?
It is a core theme, and I've already used it several times just in our conversation. Crypto-religious art, and I mean art, literature, music, film, in my account, is work that makes explicit use of religious imagery and motifs, themes, but from a point of view, something other than that of conventional belief. So when you encounter it, you're forced to try to figure out, well, what does the person who makes this work believe? Does Dylan really go in for this Christian stuff, or is he just using the metaphors? Does Wim Wenders in Wings of Desire really have a concept of an angelic world over and above this one, or is it just a neat cinematic motif? So in the course of asking yourself, as you're encountering the work, what does the person who made this believe? The question of what you believe and what the nature of belief as such is, it becomes alive and becomes part of your encounter with the work. And I think you can see this happening again and again in the work that that fills the book.
Paul, is it possible to have a lasting work of art that isn't crypto-religious? And I ask that not as a religious person, but in a secular way. I mean, can you imagine what now we think of as a great work of art or literature or film or music that doesn't have some sort of crypto-religious element, or couldn't be at least interpreted by some to have a crypto-religious element? And isn't, in that sense, what Dylan is responding to, he was sort of moving away from being treated almost as a god by his generation?
Yeah, I do think it's very possible to have work that doesn't have a crypto-religious dimension. I devoted the book to trying to identify work that is crypto-religious because there's plenty of stuff that isn't. I think a whole lot of modern art doesn't have anything to do with religion. Picasso and Braque and people like that. Ditto with modern music. A lot of the 19th century novel, as James Wood and other critics have pointed out, represents an emancipation from religion into this worldly concerns. I don't know of a strong religious reading of Jane Austen's work. People can read Dickens either way. By the time you get to Proust, it's a religion of sensibility, if that, but that's a stretch. So yeah, I think that there's some work that doesn't really have a religious dimension except in the broadest possible sense of what it means to be human or something like that.
You begin the book with reference to two very influential books, which you see in a crypto-religious sense. One is obvious, The Handmaid's Tale, which seems perhaps the most prescient book written in the 80s, certainly about America. Margaret Atwood was on the show a few years ago talking about it. And then White Noise, DeLillo's masterpiece. I'd never really thought of it in religious terms. Perhaps you might explain why those two books, and particularly White Noise, have a crypto-religious significance, and why they're important in terms of the period you're writing about.
So the challenge, in a sense, the whole book is an attempt to define this crypto-religious phenomenon so that we can identify it in the works at hand, in our own lives, in works that aren't touched on in the book, and to put a name to this phenomenon that as yet remains largely unnamed. And that's audacious, but that's what authors of long books try to do. So having defined it propositionally in the way that I just did to you about what it makes you wonder about what the person who made it believes, I then try to define it by using examples. And I draw a contrast between The Handmaid's Tale and White Noise. Now, The Handmaid's Tale, a prescient book, as you say, is thick with religious imagery, right from the title on down. The reference to the handmaiden is a biblical term. But I don't think there's any question as you're reading the book about what Margaret Atwood believes. She's set against Christianity, and she's using the motifs of Christianity and a kind of futurism to create a portrait of a dystopian future where religion has kind of run away with things. So her point of view is very clear. When you get to White Noise, DeLillo, it's a fantastically worldly book set in a college town with supermarkets where the lights never go off, and exotic departments of Hitler studies and Elvis studies and so forth. But there's a couple of weird episodes that bookend the novel that are really powerfully thick with religious imagery. I'll just choose one. At the end of the book, Gladney, the protagonist, he's killed a man and escaped, and he winds up having an encounter with a nun, as if, at the gates of heaven, and he has a conversation with her. She's dressed in the old garments, and he's so gratified that somebody believes still in the old verities. And she says, "What do you mean believe?" And he says, "Well, you do believe, don't you?" She says, "No, we just, our role is to carry out the old things for people like you." And he says, you mean your dedication is a pretense?" And she says, "No, our pretense is a dedication." So the whole question of whether a kind of metaphorical religion is less valid than so-called authentic or real religion is raised in that passage, and the whole almost mystical dimension of the novel is deepened in that exchange. And so we wind up wondering, what does DeLillo believe? He was raised a Catholic and went to Jesuit schools, by the way.
What strikes me about both The Handmaid's Tale and White Noise is they're both aggressively American books, or certainly books aggressively trying to make sense or make unsense of America. Atwood told me that she wrote Handmaid's Tale to imagine a totalitarian America. And of course, there's no more American writer than DeLillo. In terms of the narrative in your book, of course, it's an American book. And you're not sort of a global comparativist. But was the art, faith, sex, and controversy in the 80s in America, was it reflected elsewhere? You mentioned Wenders, of course, and his Wings of Desire, which was a German movie. But was this a uniquely American decade in terms of your narrative?
It wasn't exclusively American or even uniquely American. It was distinctly American in the sense that you had a couple of things happening in North America, in the United States especially, that weren't happening elsewhere. Christianity had been the dominant religion for a couple of hundred years and was suddenly uh, one religion among many because of large-scale immigration that began in the 1970s. By the 80s, many people from South Asia and Asia were making up a new population in the United States. So you suddenly had on the ground a kind of multi-religious America, and for various reasons, science, education, the 60s, there was a strong contingent of people who rejected belief altogether. So you went from it being a predominantly Christian country to a post-secular country with a fluid religious mix in the space of 15 or 20 years. Now, this happened in England and other places in different ways and in different times, but it was really dramatic in America in that moment. So then to your question, well, was it exclusively American? No, but so U2 are a good example. They're Irish. They are a blend of religions in the band from the beginning. Bono has a Protestant Church of Ireland mother and a Catholic father, I think. Edge's parents are devout Presbyterians. The drummer, Larry Mullen's father, had been a Catholic seminarian, and Adam Clayton just stood clear of religion. So they had the whole mix right in the band. Early on in Ireland and England, they declared as evangelical Christians and made a big deal about it. Then as they got big in America, they realized that to be an evangelical Christian in this country, where the moral majority is in the driver's seat of evangelical Christianity, and abortion and gay rights and a not so subtle segregationist perspective are part of the evangelical package, they realized this was a whole different scene over here, and they had to adapt. And one of the stories I tell in the book is how they adapted their Christianity to embrace American roots music, gospel, blues, and Bob Dylan.
You talk about, you use a phrase, and you had it in the book as well. It sounded an academic phrase, and I kind of guess I understand what I mean by it, but perhaps you might define this term post-secular society. Was America post-secular in the 60s and 70s? You talk about these long decades. So in a sense, the 60s came to an end in the late 70s. But was the 60s the post-secular age, or was it the 80s that we experienced this post-secularism? And what exactly does that mean?
So the post-secular age or era began in late 79 in the way I've framed it dramatically in the book. And here's why.
Yeah, with Slow Train Coming.
Well, with a lot of other things, but that was the popular work of art that serves as a marker for some larger phenomenon. So post-secular is a scholarly term. My colleague, the sociologist of religion, Jose Casanova, Jürgen Habermas in the German-speaking world, Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, have all devoted thousands of pages to writing about this phenomenon. But put pretty simply, it goes like this. The assumption of the modern narrative was that modernity represented an emancipation from religion, and that the more modern the world got, the more secular it got. And that was the assumption behind the Industrial Revolution, behind a lot of rising democracies, plenty of other phenomena, and for good reasons. But around the time that my book begins, it became clear that the progressive secularization of society, if it had ever been happening at all, was no longer happening. You actually had new religions coming onto the scene in the United States. You had old religions asserting themselves with a terrifying vigor, like in Iran. No one would tell Salman Rushdie that it was just a secular society, because he was placed in a terrible regimen of fear by religious fanatics. So various events, hostage taking, rise of the moral majority, the aggressive posturing of or aggressive statements of the Catholic Church about sexuality in the 80s, and then presence of Islam and so forth, all made clear that religion wasn't on a track to eventually go away. It's a fact on the ground, is going to remain so, and the challenge is rather to kind of figure out how to deal with it in an honest way instead of to wish for it to go away.
Yeah, it's what Max Weber, the great sociologist, of course, described as disenchantment. Nietzsche writes about this too, suggesting that perhaps it was optimistic and troubling to imagine us getting beyond enchantment. Do you believe that, Paul? Is you talk about this post-secularism, but is post-religion, is that perhaps even almost a religious idea? Is it an impossibility for us humans?
Well, there are thinkers, who have,
Well, I'm interested in your view, not
right.
other people's.
I don't think realistically there's any usefulness in imagining a world without religion. No, it's not going to happen. In fact, and one of the points you made earlier in the conversation was that when, let's say, institutional religion declines, something else with religious characteristics emerges to take its place. And a lot of Andy Warhol's work has been interpreted in these terms, as seeing fame as a kind of iconography and stars as saints or holy personages. I don't altogether go along with that. So no, I don't think it's useful to imagine a post-religious society. I think religion is a fact on the ground. And in the same way, you mentioned the theory of disenchantment. One of the stories I'm trying to bring out in the book, and I don't use the disenchantment, enchantment term, is that for the people who are this book's protagonists, the world was and is still enchanted. Leonard Cohen sang "If It Be Your Will," addressed to God or a God without irony. When Dylan sang "I Believe in You," he seemed to mean it. And weirdly enough, when Sinead O'Connor sang "I Believe in You" on the far side of being pilloried by religious conservatives, she still seemed to mean it. And the examples are legion in the book that in one way or another, these folks still live in an enchanted world, and that's where they make their work, but they do so cryptically.
Yeah, and a lot of the artists you deal with, Prince, of course, Madonna goes without saying, even Robert Mapplethorpe, Patti Smith, who you cover in the book. But when you come to someone like Mapplethorpe and Smith, and particularly Mapplethorpe, who was profoundly shocking in his own way,
so
can one, I mean, I'm not sure if I can ask the question clearly, Paul, but by definition, how do you escape any of this? How do you become radical? How can you escape what you call this quasi religious thinking, this cryptic religiosity? Is it possible? Is that what the 80s was about, from Prince to Madonna to Warhol to Mapplethorpe to Patti Smith to Sinead O'Connor to Leonard Cohen to Bob Dylan? They're all trying to do the same thing.
So yeah, the people in the book, not only did they not escape a religiosity that many of them had since childhood, in important ways they didn't wish to. They wished to, in Henry James's terms about Hawthorne, transmute it into art. James said, referring to the burden that Hawthorne felt as a Puritan, you could labor under the yoke, you could throw off the yoke, or you could transmute the yoke into art. And this third approach is more or less the approach of the people that the book describes. So there are plenty of photographers who were raised Catholic who just moved on and didn't hang on to that imagery. There are plenty of singers of Patti Smith's generation who had a religious childhood and then just kind of left it behind. But Patti Smith, I characterize her as first a devotee. She's again and again seen in a stance of devotion to the French poets, to the great rockers of the 60s generation just before hers. to Dylan. In a way, she's even been devoted to Pope Francis in recent years. So her crypto religiosity takes the form of a passionate, unironic, unreconstructed feeling of devotion. And at a certain point in her career, this is brought out in the book in '79, she was very close to having a very direct devotion to Jesus. And she talked about it with, of all people, William Burroughs, in a conversation that they had at the time, but was kind of too hot to handle, so it wasn't published for a couple of decades. In the case of Mapplethorpe, I in no way claim that he was a Christian believer. He was a person who, by his own account, and by the pretty evident account of his work, as interpreted by his strongest critics, in particular Arthur Danto, worked with the basic religion imagery of heaven and hell, of desire and need, of abjection and subjugation, and it's there in the Death's Head in one of his works. It's there in the Devil's Mask that he wore. It's there in a BBC interview where he spoke of being a Catholic boy after all these years, ever since he saw a nude, bloody Jesus on the cross in Queens. So I'm not just fancifully finding this stuff, and I'm not saying that Mapplethorpe's crypto religiosity is akin to Leonard Cohen's, or akin to Bono's, or akin to Martin Scorsese's. The excitement of the book is identifying all these specific varieties of this disposition and seeing how they fit together narratively.
It seems, Paul, as if this is an incredibly personal book. In the introduction, you write about yourself as a much younger man 40 years ago, riding the D train in New York City with pensées in a black bag. Is there a sort of a personally nostalgic quality to this narrative and the project? Are you trying to remember, or perhaps even go back to that earlier, perhaps more innocent time?
I don't think of it as nostalgic, and I hope it doesn't feel that way.
I don't mean that in a critical way. I mean,
I think it's not a first-person book for the most part. In many respects, it's written in the first-person plural. It's trying to register the experience of a whole cohort of us who, in my view, we were
right, but it's your team. It's a book
we were
about your
formed
team.
by this work and this moment in the way that other people were formed by the '60s or the civil rights movement or wartime or whatever. I would say that by all means, the work and the moment that I've devoted this book to were the moment when I was formed. And why was I formed that way? In some respects, the effort of writing the book is an attempt to figure that out. But to answer the question more directly, this work spoke to me. Its use of religious imagery and motifs felt real in a way that both resonated with my Catholic upbringing and seemed, in important respects, more authentic than some of the more brittle formulations that were coming out of the church at that moment, especially about city life and about life as a young person.
If we're to historicize, you bookend this between Dylan's Slow Train Coming and Sinead O'Connor's notorious Saturday Night Live appearance, I think in 1982. But if we were to bookend it in generational terms, of course, The Who wrote about their generation, very famous 1960s song, I Hope I Die Before I Get Old. And then the 90s came, which was a deeply satirical, perhaps even disappointed decade. Lots of books have been written about that. How would you define then your generation, the people that you write about, this cultural moment? Is it, when you bookend it between the 60s and 70s and the 90s, is it more religious, more devout, more faithful than the period before and after? And is your generation then defined in that context?
It's a really good question and a complex one. Let me answer it in a double way. First of all, the decade in question is usually characterized by its political leaders, by Reagan and Thatcher. And their presence was real, but around about 1981, 82, when I was finishing high school and going to college at Fordham University in New York, where I began in 83, the media were constantly telling us that it was the Reagan 80s, the 60s were over, the present generation of youth were boring, and everybody just wanted to be bankers, and were pure materialists, and Madonna's Material Girl, exemplified that. And not only was that not, I knew that wasn't true of myself. I haven't wanted to be a banker for a moment of my life. But more than that, I knew from experience that I was living in an artistically exciting time. I saw Talking Heads on the Remain in Light tour when I was 14 years old. I saw The Clash twice, before I could drink, and on and on and on.
Legally, anyway,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, in other words, my experience told me that we were going through an incredibly rich moment. I couldn't get enough of it. I don't think I even slept for the 4 years I was in college because I was so excited to be getting a fantastic education.
Where did you go to
Fordham
college?
University in the Bronx, Jesuit university, really intellectually rich at the time, stacked with Jesuits at the peak moments of their careers, many of them, and then living a whole other life in Manhattan, going to see art films and bands. This week it's Husker Du, and this week it's the Violent Femmes, and this week it's Gang of Four, record stores, shows, Stranger Than Paradise one week and Blood Simple the next. It was fantastically stimulating, and so I've tried to capture that sense of almost overload in the book, and it's a long book partly to suggest just how dense with experience of a crypto-religious nature that decade was.
Do you think your life in the 80s, all this alternative culture, and yet going to Fordham and obviously being affected and thinking about more traditional religion, that your life reflected that struggle within crypto religiosity?
Absolutely.
I mean, I assume you had moments where perhaps you sensed the calling. You've spent your life as an art critic, writer, teacher, but you might have ended up in the clergy, mightn't you? You have the focus, the intensity, it seems to me.
I always felt from being a teenager, before I really even understood Catholicism, I wanted to be a writer. John McPhee and Tom Wolfe were the people who really put me on the path that I'm still on, and I wound up getting to work in a sustained way with both of them at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. It was just an incredible homecoming, I guess. But I use a term in the book. It's a term I think that I devised. I say that many of us in that moment in particular were controverts, which is to say that we were controverted, divided against ourselves. And the controversies of the 80s that are now locked into a narrative of the culture wars, I tried to walk that back to what we were actually feeling in our individual lives, that it wasn't about what some senator said about some photograph. The controversy existed in our, Bono sings about the war in our hearts or something like that. We're divided against ourselves, and we're trying to reconcile that. In an old theological sense, that division is the division that's described by original sin. Paul says there's, the law of God, and there's another law in my members, in my body. So the body and spirit at war with each other. It wasn't so dramatic for me, but to be in New York in that moment, loving all the best new records and films, and being educated by these very sophisticated progressive Jesuits, and at the same time picking up the tabloids and seeing Cardinal O'Connor and Pope John Paul make these apodictic pronouncements about sexuality and about gay people whose suffering was evident to all of us on the street. You couldn't live there in that moment, or I couldn't, without being controverted, divided against myself, and without trying to sort it out somehow. And I found a rough and ready solution back then, and I think a deeper reconciliation is what I hope I've worked out in some fashion through the book.
And isn't that the religious condition from Augustine onwards, this notion of being divided upon oneself? That's what essentially human religion is, isn't it?
I definitely think that's central to Christianity. I'm not enough of an authority on Judaism or on Buddhism or Hinduism to say whether our alienation from ourselves, spans the religions. But the religious tradition that I know well, it's certainly central to it. But those things, even if they're perennial, it's one thing to hear the quote from St. Paul that I just roughly paraphrased, and another thing to hear Morrissey singing, "When will you accept yourself?" And he's working out in that song from their first record and from the Hatful of Hollow sessions, the drama of the divided self that was on the syllabus at the Catholic schools where he went. And the question of when you're going to accept yourself is double-edged. In one sense, the Catholic educators urged people to accept themselves as mortal, limited, finite creatures. On the other, if that mortal, finite, limited creature turned out to be gay, as Morrissey did, that was an aspect of the self that he wasn't supposed to accept. And it's no wonder he's so tormented on that track.
Paul, I mentioned the 90s. Chuck Klosterman wrote a best-selling book called The 90s, which was about the ironic detachment of that decade. Do you think that Klosterman's treatment of the 90s, and there have been other books, we've dealt with some of their authors, was the 90s a sharp reaction to the crypto-religiosity of the 80s? People just had enough of all this stuff and wanted to detach themselves.
I'd love to ask Klosterman about that. He's quoted in my book. He describes the fans of the Smiths as the Fey underground, and it's just a perfect expression. As we were saying at the beginning of the conversation, the formula of decades is a bit brittle. So I had the good luck to work at Spy Magazine. Now, Spy Magazine started, I think, in late 86 or early 87. Fantastic satirical news magazine coming out of New York that is widely thought to have anticipated or set going what Spy itself called the irony epidemic that characterized the 90s. But Spy had it already going on in 86 and 87. So to some extent, the crypto-religious stuff and early irony were coexisting. And it's only in retrospect that we can unpack them. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of the hour also, you called The Satanic Verses a 1988 novel. And I'm so glad, because that gets to the point of what I'm explaining here. For us in America, Satanic Verses came out in 89, and a fatwa was declared on February 14th, 89, Valentine's Day. So we remember it as an 89 book. But it was circulating in page proofs in England beginning in August 88, which is to say the controversy over the Satanic Verses in England began 2 or 3 weeks after the controversy over The Last Temptation of Christ happened in New York. They belong to the same moment, even though in most narratives, because one's in England and one's in the United States, they're almost seen as having taken place in different decades. Most narratives describe the Rushdie affair as belonging to the 90s, not the 80s. But one of the fun things about writing a book like this is you get to see kind of all the stuff that's happening, elbow to elbow chronologically.
Maybe Scorsese was lucky that no one issued a fatwa against him. You mentioned, but going back to Rushdie, of course, Rushdie was very close to Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens very much involved in the Rushdie affair, and then became, I think, one of the supposed four horsemen of aggressive atheism with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. How much does this development of an aggressive polemical atheism. How much was this? How much could you trace this, the seeds of Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris, back to the 80s?
I think it can be traced very directly to the fatwa against Rushdie and the introduction of violence into the conversation. So basically, Rushdie put out the novel. There were protests all over England. The book was burned. There were death threats. Then came the call from the Ayatollah Khomeini to pious Muslims to kill Rushdie. Again, February 14th, 89. That day or in the days following, it was publication of the book in America, and Hitchens read with a bunch of other people in downtown Manhattan. They all read passages from the novel. And Hitchens likened Rushdie to an Anglo-Indian Voltaire. That is an exponent of a broad European humanism that was under threat by religious fanatics. Violence was introduced into the whole consideration of the crypto-religious dimension of a work of art. Cardinal O'Connor, the Archbishop of New York, actually sided with the Ayatollah Khomeini, saying that the novel was offensive, even though he hadn't read it. And he did so from the pulpit of St. Patrick's. And then I was startled to even realize this doing the research for the book. The American senators who ganged up on Andre Serrano and then on Robert Mapplethorpe, these guys were the most chest-beating, supposedly patriotic Americans in their own minds. They stole their tactic from the Ayatollah Khomeini, from the enemy. He threatened Rushdie with a fatwa. They ganged up on a single artist, Serrano and then Mapplethorpe, who was already dead. What easier target could there be? And things were off and running. And once violence is part of the picture, people are forced to take sides in a much more absolute way. And then when the World Trade Center is attacked in 93, so the epilogue to the book is called Hard Lines. The book as a whole tells the story of a moment where there was a kind of permeable membrane between belief, unbelief, and disbelief. And those lines hardened after the fatwa against Rushdie, and people like Hitchens, he went from representing Rushdie as a good European humanist to himself being a scourge of religion and a kind of anti-heretic hunting atheist because of what had been done to his friend.
Yeah, I think Rushdie joked to Hitchens when Hitchens' book "God Is Not Great" came out. Of course, it had a big impact. Rushdie said the book should have just been called "God Is Not." Although I think Hitchens was also critical of Rushdie for declaring himself a Muslim later. That's so much here, but let's end. You've been very generous with your time, Paul. Let's end in 2025. You write for The New Yorker. You've written extensively about the first American Pope. I don't want to talk about the first American Pope. I mean, maybe we can do another show on that. But in 2025, in a very different world from the 1980s, how do we trace 2025 back to the 80s in very broad strokes?
So let's see. 2025, we witnessed the death of a pope who was both beloved and divided a lot of people, Pope Francis, and the election of a new pope who was born in Chicago, has deep roots in North America, in South America, and in Europe as a member of the Vatican Curia. And all the eyes of the world, it seemed, I was in Rome, so I couldn't really tell, were trained on Rome and the conclave for a couple of weeks. So post-secular age is the argument I'm making. We're in that age. Not so long ago, we were, with some justification, vilifying the cardinals and their predecessors as accessories to the crime of clerical sexual abuse. And that hasn't been forgotten, but the the power of the death of a pope and the election of a new pope draws on the recognition of religion as a fact on the ground, and the recognition of religious imagery and motifs and patterns as having a really distinct explanatory power that nothing else has. It's a distinct aspect of life, and I think the attention paid to Pope Francis and Pope Leo reflects some of the same yearnings that led people to be drawn to Gloria by U2 or Beloved by Toni Morrison.
Well, that's good stuff. Lots of things to think about. It's a dense book full of wonderful cultural, political, literary commentary. The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s. It's out now, but it has contemporary relevance. Paul Elie, thank you so much, and best of luck with the book. Paul, we'll have to get you back on to talk more specifically about the American Pope, and maybe your next book you can write about not so much crypto religion as a crypto religion, but maybe cryptocurrency as religion. Anyway, thank you so much. Excellent
It's been a pleasure.
conversation.
Thank you so much.